I speak now of a story that has been whispered for centuries in the draughty halls of Scotland's castles, in the creaking timber rooms where the wind rattles old shutters and the rain lashes against stone walls like the fingers of the dead. It is the tale of a curse, one said to have been born in betrayal, sealed with blood, and carried by the crown of Scotland from one monarch to the next. Its most infamous name is the Curse of Mary Stuart, though the roots of its poison sink far deeper into the soil than the life of the tragic queen herself. And if we are to uncover the truth, we must begin where history itself begins to shiver, in the year 1565, within the dark heart of Holyrood Palace. Mary Stuart, Queen of Scots, had returned from the glittering but treacherous court of France to claim her rightful throne. Her beauty was spoken of across Europe, a figure tall and regal, with hair the color of autumn copper, and eyes that could both warm and freeze a man in a single glance. Yet beauty is rarely a blessing for a monarch. More often it is a weapon, and just as often, a curse. Her reign began with fragile hope, but hope is a fragile thing in Scotland, and it was soon entangled in the thorns of politics. The nobles muttered against her, some because she was Catholic in a country swelling with Protestant fervor, others because her blood carried the scent of foreign courts, and others still because they hungered for the throne themselves. It was in this storm that Mary made a choice which would set the foundations of this curse: her marriage to Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley. Darnley was handsome, charming, and a cousin to the Queen. His claim to the English throne through his Tudor lineage made him a valuable political prize. But beneath the fine silks and the gallant manners lay a man of dangerous ambition and reckless pride. He desired not only Mary's hand, but her power to rule as King of Scots in more than name alone. The wedding took place on the 29th of July, 1565, within the Chapel Royal of Holyrood Palace. There were banners of crimson and gold, the air thick with incense, and the solemn chanting of priests echoing against the cold stone walls. Yet, according to a legend kept alive in the shadows, an ill-omened figure lingered at the edge of the crowd. She was said to be an elderly woman from the Highlands, her clothes ragged, her hair like tangled silver, her eyes black as a winter lock. Witnesses claimed she did not bow, nor did she smile, but stared at the Queen throughout the ceremony, her lips moving soundlessly. When the newlyweds passed her, she raised her voice for all to hear. "Blood shall follow blood, and no wedding in this crown's line shall end without death. By this ring you bind your house to the grave." Guards moved to seize her, but she was gone as if swallowed by the air itself. The court dismissed it as drunken madness. But some servants whispered it was no mere woman, but a nighe, a washerwoman spirit from Highland lore, an omen of death for royal blood. The Queen herself, though outwardly composed, was said to have turned pale. Darnley's true nature began to reveal itself soon after. He was jealous of Mary's closest advisors, particularly her Italian secretary, David Rizzio. This jealousy, inflamed by the whispers of ambitious nobles, festered into rage. The king grew more arrogant, demanding the crown matrimonial, which would make him equal sovereign. Mary refused, and so the first betrayal struck. On a March evening in 1566, Mary was at supper with Rizzio and a small company in Holyrood. The fire burned low, the shadows long, when Darnley entered with a group of armed men. Their boots echoed on the flagstones like the drums of war. Before Mary could rise, they seized Rizzio. The Queen cried out, but Darnley held her fast, his arm pressing against the life stirring in her belly, for she was with child. They dragged Rizzio from her presence, stabbing him over 50 times until his body lay in a crimson heap. The killing was meant as a warning to Mary, a demonstration of who truly held power. But it only deepened her resolve and turned the marriage into a battlefield. It was then that rumors began to coil around the court like mist. Servants swore they heard strange weeping in the corridors at night, the sound of a woman mourning. Horses in the royal stables were found restless, their eyes rolling in terror. Even the candles in the chapel guttered as if blown by invisible breath. The washerwoman's curse, they whispered, had begun its work. Over the months that followed, the Queen and Darnley's union decayed into open hatred. She plotted quietly with her trusted circle, even as she played the dutiful wife in public. The king, for his part, sank into paranoia and drunkenness. By early 1567, the air in Holyrood felt heavy, as though waiting for something to break. And then, one February night, it did. Darnley, ill and convalescing at Kirk in Edinburgh, was visited by Mary. They spoke civilly, perhaps even tenderly, though none knew what words passed between them. Hours later, in the dead of night, an explosion shattered the quiet. The house where Darnley lay was blown apart. His body was found not in the ruins, but in a nearby garden, dressed only in a nightshirt. There was no sign of burns or blast wounds, only strangulation. The court was thrown into chaos. Some cried treason, others divine punishment. But in the murmured corners of the palace, one phrase was repeated: "The curse has claimed its first husband." And I tell you this, it was not the last. The morning after the explosion, Edinburgh awoke to a silence heavy with dread. The bells of St. Giles tolled not for celebration but for suspicion. Crowds gathered in the winds and closes, whispering of the king's fate, their breath visible in the cold air. Lord Darnley, the once proud husband of Mary Stuart, lay cold in a shroud, and no man could agree on how he had met his end. His body had been found a strange distance from the demolished house, unmarked by fire, but with the unmistakable signs of strangulation. It was as if the blast had been a theatrical curtain, meant to distract from the murder that had truly taken place. The common folk muttered that no assassin could slip past the divine justice of God. Yet in their eyes, God's wrath had perhaps been aimed not at Darnley, but at the Queen herself. Mary, upon hearing the news in the early hours, locked herself in her chambers. Some said she wept. Others swore her face was as cold as the February frost. She summoned her most trusted attendants, and before the day was out, the palace corridors buzzed with the names of suspects. Foremost among them was James Hepburn, the 4th Earl of Bothwell, a man whose shadow would soon darken all of Scotland. Bothwell was no ordinary noble. He was fierce in battle, cunning in council, and utterly ruthless in ambition. His loyalty to the Queen was spoken of openly, but so were the rumors of something deeper, a bond that went beyond politics. Some claimed Mary and Bothwell were already lovers before Darnley's death, though no proof was ever offered that could be shown in court without igniting civil war. The crime scene at Kirk was examined in the most primitive manner of the age. No constables, no forensic science, only the sharp eyes of rival nobles searching for evidence that would suit their cause. A black cloak, a glove, and a mysterious length of rope were found near the garden wall. No one could prove who had left them there. The explosion itself had been so violent that much of the house lay in splinters, and the smell of gunpowder lingered in the air for days. But the real investigation was not conducted in public. It took place in the candlelit chambers of Holyrood, where whispers held more power than swords. Mary's enemies were quick to use the king's death as a blade to strike at her rule. They formed a coalition, the Confederate Lords, who claimed to be the protectors of the realm against a murderous queen. They began sending letters to Elizabeth of England, seeking her intervention. And in the heart of all this, the memory of the ragged Highland woman returned. Servants swore they saw her again, standing at the far end of the palace courtyard on the day of Darnley's funeral. No guard had seen her enter, yet there she was, her hands red as if from washing blood-soaked cloth, her eyes fixed upon the Queen's window. She spoke no words this time. She only raised her hands to her face and let out a keening wail so mournful that even hardened soldiers felt their skin crawl. Within days of the funeral, Bothwell acted with audacity. He gathered a group of sympathetic nobles and demanded that Mary declare him innocent of any role in the king's murder. The trial was arranged with almost indecent speed, and on the appointed day, Bothwell walked into the court in full armor, his head held high. Witnesses against him were either absent or silenced. Evidence lay conveniently missing. The verdict was inevitable: Bothwell was acquitted. But acquittal did not erase suspicion. In fact, it only deepened it. What happened next remains one of the most contested chapters of Mary's life. Barely a month after his trial, Bothwell intercepted the Queen's party on the road between Linlithgow and Edinburgh. He rode at the head of 800 men. Some claimed it was an abduction, the ravishment of the Queen. Others, that Mary had arranged the entire spectacle to provide a cover for her next marriage. For within weeks, she and Bothwell were wed. The wedding was held at Holyrood on the 15th of May, 1567. But it was unlike her first union. The banners were fewer, the faces in attendance colder. The people muttered in the streets, calling the marriage an insult to Darnley's memory and a confirmation of the Queen's guilt. And once again, on the day of her wedding, Mary was said to have been watched by the same spectral woman. This time, the figure was seen not among the guests, but high in the gallery above the chapel, her face veiled, her head bowed in mockery. One witness swore he saw her mouth move in silent words, then vanish like smoke. That evening, a storm broke over Edinburgh, the rain slashing the palace windows as though the heavens themselves had condemned the match. What followed was not the honeymoon of a happy marriage, but the opening act of a tragedy. The Confederate lords rose in open rebellion. They marched against Mary and Bothwell, and at the Battle of Carberry Hill, the Queen's forces faltered. Bothwell fled into exile, leaving Mary to face the wrath of her enemies alone. She surrendered, perhaps in the hope of negotiation, but instead she was taken prisoner and confined to Loch Leven Castle. It was there, amid the damp stone walls and the cries of waterfowl, that Mary learned she was to be stripped of her crown. She signed the abdication under duress, naming her infant son James as King of Scots. Some claimed she did so to save her life. Others believed she had finally bowed to the curse, that no royal marriage sealed in Scotland's crown would end in peace, but only in ruin. And yet, even in her imprisonment, the Queen was not free from its shadow. Loch Leven was said to be haunted by a woman in white who walked the battlements at night, her hands wringing a bloodied wedding veil. Some of Mary's ladies-in-waiting swore they heard her sobbing outside their chamber doors, and one claimed that, in a half-sleeping state, she saw the spectre lean over the Queen's bed and whisper something into her ear. Mary never revealed what words were spoken, but from that night forward, she was said to have prayed more often, sometimes in French, sometimes in the old Gaelic tongue of her Highland ancestors. It was the beginning of her fall, but not yet the end. The curse still had more blood to demand, and the webs of conspiracy that had already ensnared her would soon stretch beyond Scotland's borders. For the death of Darnley was not an isolated act. It was a hinge upon which the fate of two kingdoms would turn, and those who had pulled the strings in shadow were not yet finished with their work. From the damp walls of Loch Leven, Mary Stuart gazed out over the cold, steel-grey waters and understood that her captivity was not merely the work of rebellious nobles. It was the endgame of a plan conceived long before Darnley ever breathed his last. The Queen was not merely a prisoner. She was a piece on a vast chessboard, moved by unseen hands that had already decided her fate. The question that still haunts history is this: who killed Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley? The official verdict was silence. No trial ever brought the guilty to justice. But in the smoke-filled chambers of Edinburgh and the whispering galleries of London, names were spoken in low voices, names that have survived in letters and confessions hidden for centuries. The first name was, of course, James Hepburn, Earl of Bothwell. His enemies saw in him the perfect villain, ambitious, ruthless, and conveniently close to the Queen. Yet to those who studied the matter more closely, his involvement seemed too obvious, almost theatrical, as though someone had placed him in the role for all to see while the true conspirators stood in the wings. One such figure was James Douglas, the fourth Earl of Morton. A Protestant noble and one of the most calculating minds in Scotland, Morton had long opposed Mary's Catholic sympathies. His loyalty was not to any monarch, but to the stability of a Protestant realm, and to the growing influence of England. Morton was among those who despised Darnley, not for his arrogance, but for his unpredictable loyalties. A man with Tudor blood could easily turn his ambitions toward the English throne, upsetting the delicate balance between the two kingdoms. Another shadowy name was William Maitland of Lethington, the Queen's own Secretary of State. Maitland was the master of double-dealing, a man who could smile at Mary in the morning and dine with her enemies at night. He was suspected of corresponding in secret with Elizabeth's ministers, feeding them fragments of Scotland's troubles in exchange for promises of protection. To such a man, the removal of Darnley was not murder, it was a political necessity. And above them all loomed the unseen presence of Elizabeth I of England. Did she know? Did she approve? Officially, the English Queen expressed horror at the news of Darnley's death and urged a thorough investigation. But letters preserved in English archives reveal her counselors, men like William Cecil, saw in the chaos a chance to weaken Mary beyond recovery. A Catholic queen with a claim to Elizabeth's throne was a threat that needed not to be killed outright, but discredited beyond redemption. The evidence of such orchestration lies in the curious speed with which events unfolded after Darnley's murder. Within weeks, Bothwell was acquitted, Mary married him, and rebellion erupted, almost as if the script had been written beforehand. The Confederate lords, many of whom had been present at Bothwell's trial, now used the marriage as their justification to overthrow her. It was too neat, too precise, like the turning of a lock. And then there was the matter of the casket letters. In June 1567, after Mary's capture, her enemies claimed to have discovered a small silver casket containing letters and sonnets allegedly written by her to Bothwell. These documents, if genuine, implicated her not only in an affair, but in Darnley's murder itself. The handwriting was said to be hers, the tone intimate, the details damning. But questions arose immediately. Why had these letters never been produced before her defeat? Why were they conveniently in the possession of the very nobles who now sought to keep her in prison? And why did several translations into Scots and French differ in key details? Some historians suspect the letters were forgeries, crafted by Maitland and Morton to destroy her credibility. Others believe fragments of genuine correspondence were altered to serve a darker purpose. Whatever the truth, the effect was devastating. The people of Scotland, already unsettled by the swift remarriage, now saw their queen as an adulteress and a murderess. The curse, whether supernatural or political, had worked its will. The marriage bed was soaked in blood, and the crown lay in enemy hands. Yet Loch Leven could not hold Mary forever. In May 1568, aided by loyal supporters, she escaped her prison disguised as a servant. The night was dark, the loch waters black as ink. She was rowed to the shore, where a horse waited. Within hours, banners were raised in her name, and an army gathered. But fate, or perhaps the curse, was not with her. At the Battle of Langside, her forces were crushed, and Mary fled once more, this time south into England, seeking the protection of her cousin Elizabeth. She could not have made a worse choice. Elizabeth received her as an honored guest, at least on paper. In truth, Mary was placed under a genteel form of house arrest, moved from castle to castle under guard. For 19 years she would remain in England, a living danger to Elizabeth's throne, a rallying point for Catholic plots. The English queen could not openly execute a fellow monarch without cause, but cause would come soon enough. During those long years of captivity, Mary aged beyond her years. Her once bright hair grew silver, her health declined, and yet she held to her dignity. Those who saw her in these years claimed she still wore the bearing of a queen, though her gowns were worn and her jewels few. But the curse had not forgotten her. Every year brought fresh conspiracies, plots to place her on the English throne, to assassinate Elizabeth, to incite Catholic uprisings. And with each uncovered plot, Mary's enemies tightened the net. The final blow came with the Babington plot of 1586, a conspiracy to murder Elizabeth and crown Mary in her place. Whether she truly consented or was lured into agreeing by agents provocateurs remains debated, but the letters used to implicate her were enough to seal her fate. In February 1587, Mary Stuart was executed at Fotheringhay Castle. She wore a crimson petticoat beneath her black gown, the color of martyrdom in the Catholic faith. As the axe fell, it is said a great cry of wind swept through the hall, though the day outside was still. Some whispered that the washerwoman had been seen in the crowd, her face hidden, her hands wet with red. But here is the truth. The curse did not die with her. For Mary's son, James VI of Scotland, later James I of England, would marry, and his descendants would rule over Britain. And in the generations that followed, tragedy would follow their weddings as faithfully as a shadow follows the sun. It was as if the ragged woman's words, "blood shall follow blood," had been stitched into the very fabric of the monarchy. And so we turn now to the final part of this tale, where we shall trace the path of the curse beyond Mary's grave, through the Stuart line, and into the bloody pages of history that followed. When the axe fell at Fotheringhay and the Queen of Scots lay lifeless, the cold stone floor beneath her stained with her final breath, many believed the curse had ended. After all, what spirit could trouble a woman whose head had been severed from her body? Yet the dark thread that had begun in the chapel of Holyrood Palace, on that summer day when Mary wed Henry Stuart, did not fray with her death. It wound itself instead around her bloodline, binding her heirs to a pattern of joy curdled into grief. Mary's only son, James VI of Scotland, had been an infant when she was forced to abdicate. Raised among Protestant lords and schooled in the ways of political survival, he inherited not only the Scottish crown but also a shrewd instinct for self-preservation. Yet even he could not escape the shadow that clung to the Stuart name. In 1589, James married Anne of Denmark. The match had been arranged for alliance, but the journey to seal it was almost thwarted by the sea itself. Anne's voyage to Scotland was beset by violent storms, forcing her to take refuge in Norway. James, impatient and restless, sailed himself to fetch her. A rare act for a king, but his own crossing nearly ended in disaster. The winds howled, waves towered like walls, and lightning split the sky. In later years, whispers claimed that these storms were the work of witchcraft, part of a conspiracy to prevent the union. The ensuing witch trials in North Berwick, the most notorious in Scottish history, would see dozens tortured and executed, some confessing under agony that they had raised the tempest to strike at the king's bride. The wedding finally took place in Denmark, but upon their return to Scotland, and suffered multiple miscarriages before bearing healthy children. Courtiers muttered that the curse had followed them across the sea, its price extracted not in the king's life, but in the lives of the unborn. When James ascended the English throne in 1603, uniting the crowns, it seemed a triumph. The blood of Mary Stuart now ruled over the very realm that had imprisoned and executed her. Yet the curse did not rest. It appeared next in the reign of James's son, Charles I. Charles wed Henrietta Maria of France in 1625, a Catholic princess in a kingdom torn between Protestant and Catholic factions. Their wedding was marked by protests in the streets, and the air of foreboding deepened as the king's rule became increasingly autocratic. Within 2 decades, England was at war with itself. The Civil War ended not only with Charles's defeat, but with the unimaginable sight of a king executed by his own subjects. The marriage that was meant to secure dynastic stability had instead led to the ruin of a dynasty. Henrietta Maria fled into exile, her crown gone, her husband's head struck from his shoulders, an echo of Mary's own fate. The Stuart line staggered on. Charles II, restored to the throne in 1660 after years of Republican rule, married Catherine of Braganza in 1662. But their union was childless, marred by Charles's many mistresses and political intrigues. Catherine suffered repeated miscarriages, and her position was undermined by whispers that she was cursed, an accusation the king laughed off in public, though his private letters suggest he feared the superstition himself. The curse's most chilling strike came with James II, Charles's brother. His second marriage to Mary of Modena produced a son in 1688, a Catholic heir in a Protestant kingdom. The birth ignited a political firestorm. Protestants claimed the child was an impostor, smuggled into the Queen's bedchamber in a warming pan to replace a stillborn. The accusation, though baseless, provided the pretext for the so-called Glorious Revolution. James II was deposed, fleeing into exile with his queen and infant son. Once again, a royal wedding had ended not in dynastic security, but in the loss of a throne. Even beyond the direct Stuart line, the shadow lingered. The descendants of Mary Stuart, through marriages into other houses, would see their weddings followed by tragedy. One need only look to the Hanoverian kings who inherited the crown. George Ivy's marriage to Caroline of Brunswick was a public disaster, marked by mutual hatred and eventual separation. Queen Victoria, though not of the Stuart line by name, was descended from Mary through her Scottish ancestry. She adored her husband Albert, but his sudden death in 1861 plunged her into decades of mourning, the black of her widow's weeds becoming as much her emblem as the crown itself. In each of these unions, joy was brief, and the shadow fell swiftly after. But was it truly a curse? Or was it something far more human? Politics, ambition, and the inevitable cost of ruling in a world where marriage was a weapon and love a luxury rarely afforded to kings and queens? The washerwoman of Holyrood, the nighe, was never seen again after Mary's execution. Yet her prophecy lived on in the stories told by palace servants and Highland crofters alike. Some believed she had been an omen of the blood that politics would always spill in Scotland's name. Others swore she had been the ghost of a wronged woman, a distant ancestor of Mary's who had died violently before her own wedding day, condemning her line to endless sorrow. And there is one final whisper, recorded in a weather diary found in the cellars of Holyrood in the late 19th century. It belonged to a minor court official who served during the reign of James VI. In his careful script, he recounts a night when the king walked alone in the palace gardens, believing himself unseen. There, at the edge of the fountain, stood a veiled woman, her hands immersed in the water as though washing something unseen. James approached, and though the official was too far to hear her words, he saw the king recoil, his face pale. The woman vanished before his eyes. The next morning, James announced his intention to leave Edinburgh for England, never again to make Scotland his permanent home. Whether ghost, omen, or invention, the figure of the washerwoman remains tied to the blood-soaked history of the Stuart weddings. Her curse, whether real or merely the symbol of human treachery, tells a truth history will not deny. In the courts of kings and queens, the wedding veil is too often a funeral shroud in waiting. And so ends the tale of Mary Stuart's curse, a story in which love is a weapon, loyalty a mask, and every vow taken beneath the crown's weight may yet be answered by the tolling of a death bell.